Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the Devolving Restitution series, a program funded by Open Society Foundations and hosted by Afford UK. My name is Benjamina Efua Dadzie, and I am currently a PhD researcher in museum anthropology at the University of East Anglia. And until last month, a collections assistant in anthropology at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge. Today, we will talk on the theme of objects of sovereignty. One of the purposes of this webinar is to understand material culture of African heritage, which are now cared for by non-national museums in the UK. We will consider the context of the objects, how they were taken, and the implication of their continued residence in UK museums. We will then consider what the next steps should be once these collections have been identified and understood. Specifically, the conversation will speak on the themes of belonging and memory, belief, and the challenges of curatorial practice. On behalf of the whole team, I would like to thank our partners and collaborators who have made today's event possible, including the African Caribbean Society at the University of Cambridge, the Ugandan National Museum, Afford UK, Open Society Foundations, our partner curators, and Poem in the City. Before we start today's conversations, I'd like to share a few housekeeping notes. The chat and the Q&A boxes will be enabled and checked regularly, and we encourage you to send in your questions, your thoughts, and your responses. After the event, we will pull questions together and we will respond to the best of our ability, and we hope to answer most questions through our blog site, which can be found on the University of Cambridge Museum website. And a link will be shared also in the chat box for convenience. For live captions throughout the webinar, please visit Afford's Facebook page, where this webinar is also being live streamed. And a link will also be placed in the chat box for your convenience. We please ask everyone to be respectful of one another while making comments and asking questions. Disrespectful, offensive language or language meant to incite hatred will not be tolerated, and people making such remarks will be removed from the webinar. Now, I would like to share a video by MA's director and curator, Professor Nicholas Thomas, who is unfortunately unable to join us live today, but he sends his apologies. Professor Thomas's message is followed by Pitt River's Curator of World Archaeology and Professor of Contemporary Archaeology, Professor Hicks, and Afford's Executive Director, Onyekachi Wambu, who will be in conversation in the first part of the morning. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Thomas. I'm the director of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. I'm really sorry I can't join the full day today. I've got other university responsibilities, but I hope it's an incredibly rewarding day. I've been director of the museum since 2006. Throughout that period, questions of the future care, the future destinations of collections, the prospect of return have always been with us, but often hypothetically, rather than in the more concrete terms we're engaging with often in relation to a number of different countries, different communities represented in the collections. The issues are obviously massively significant. Critically at the moment, we're not so much talking about should material be returned or shouldn't it. We're talking about how that can be done, how it can effectively be done. The issues are critical. I'm delighted that MAA can be associated with this project, and I'm sure the discussions today will be rewarding. I'm also delighted that we're doing this we're working with a whole range of UK university and regional museums. I think these collaborations are critical. There's much we can learn from each other, and there's much we can learn from each other as university and regional institutions. We have capacities to act in this context that are not necessarily open to national museums. I think the conversation is rewarding, and I'm sure it's going to lead in all sorts of very positive directions. I hope for those of you who haven't been to MAA in person, you'll have the chance to visit before long. I hope we can continue the discussions in person in due course. Thank you. You're all welcome at MAA insofar as anywhere any of us are here in Cambridge physically. Thank you.
Dan, good morning.
Morning, Onyekachi.
Yes, I think they wanted us to have a conversation, but we're not going to. What I'll do is really just to thank Cambridge for this really important intervention. We'll say a few words ourselves about the work that we're doing alongside Cambridge in terms of these partnerships. But I think this session, I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be deeply informing and involving the students and another generation of people interested in these issues. I myself became interested in the 1980s when I was at the Voice newspaper, and there was a Rastafarian called Ras Seymour MacLean, who was going into the British Library and liberating books that were associated or connected with Africa. They weren't quite manuscripts, but he wanted the manuscripts, and then he was prosecuted. And we covered the trial, and he made a big deal of the trial about the issues of sovereignty and the issues that, particularly from the Ethiopian perspective and regarding the Magdala collection, that all of this needed to go back. And this was mid-1980s, and I became interested in these issues. And there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. And these conversations between different regional museums are really powerful. So we thank, first of all, thank Cambridge for continuing the conversations, but I'll hand over to you and to talk much more broadly about the Devolving Restitution initiative. And then I'll come back and also finish up with talking about some of the work that we've been doing at the Forward as part of the overall restitution campaigns.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much, Onyekachi. And so welcome to everyone to the fourth of the 6 meetings that we're holding. Of course, when we originally received the funding from Open Society Foundations, we thought that these would all be meetings we'd be having face-to-face. And I think we've really made the most, and Afford's work as our partner here has been central of actually the fact that we've had to do all these things online. But now that face-to-face is beginning to come back, and yet we're still having these conversations online, I think it's so interesting to gauge quite how much has changed. And so I've been at some face-to-face events with colleagues over the past 10 days or so in Cambridge at Jesus College, which of course has returned an item of sovereignty recently, and you might have seen on the news that exciting information about and the reporting of the return of the Jesus cockerel, actually in Nigeria to the Oba in a formal way in the past several days. But also we were at an event in London, which I want to talk a little bit about sort of last week as well. So as we're coming back, I think we're realizing quite how much has changed, and that sense of what we are able to say, what we're not able to say, how the conversation's moved on, I think is so inspiring as we're returning to these conversations sort of face to face. So let me just share an image of sovereignty, which hopefully all of you can now see, which was the coverage in the Church Times of one of the sort of works that we're involved in as a part of this wider portfolio of activity around questions of return and restitution and repair and remembrance. And of course, Onyekachi, your sort of long list of all those different sort of R words, as it were, that you have, I think really comes into focus there. Because, so as a lot of you will have sort of noted, last week marked the 125th anniversary of the attack upon Benin in Nigeria in 1897. So in order to mark that at St. Paul's, we worked with the Nigerian artists, Victor Ekamenor, to install this work next to a memorial to Rawson, who led that expedition. So it's there on show in St. Paul's until mid-May. And so I hope a lot of you sort of watching this will be able to go and see it. But I think I wanted to share actually this image, as an introduction to how we're thinking about sovereignty over the course of the day, because I think it underlines what's at stake here. So of course, this work of remembrance has to start with the physical dismantling of the structures of, which were made to make messages of sort of cultural supremacy in the late 19th century. So returning objects is central, but actually returns are sort of all about also what happens next. So what happens next is what can happen, at the point of the returns, in African communities and nations, such as we saw last week. But it's also about opening up the conversations that we can have it here in the UK as well. So fundamentally, this is about sovereignty. So I think what Victor's work sort of asks us about is about who we remember when we think about war in relation to empire, in these times where we're increasingly aware that empire was war. So it's about not only who we remember, but how we remember and who is doing the remembering. So as we seek to build in the context of those histories, sort of equitable partnerships that can rebalance actually where the agency has sort of normally sat and the flow of expertise or where power has often gone in only one direction, how to reverse that? Well, actually, fundamentally thinking about sovereignty in those terms, I think, is central. So thinking about sort of sovereignty as agency, because the taking of artworks was all about not only a cultural destruction, but also an attempt to say, who's in charge. So these were royal and sort of sacred objects in so many cases for objects that we find in our museums. So whether these are the conversations over the removal of the monuments in Cambridge, such as we see at Jesus, or whether it's about the return of objects, or whether it's about actually acquiring artworks that are able to fill the gaps in our memory. And so we were actually really happy that Art Fund have awarded us a grant in order to acquire this work for the Pitt Rivers, and we're actually hoping to tour it over the course of this anniversary year. So I'm going to unshare there, and really I think hopefully that introduces a mix of some of the things that I know that you're interested in, Onyekachi, to sort of introduce some of the themes that I know we're going to be hearing about over the course of the day. And so I'll sort of hand over to you again, but again, in order to thank you and everyone at Afford for all the work that has gone in. And it's so interesting to see this conversation outside of the National Museums sort of happening in so many different ways and really sort of landing as a conversation in different ways in different locations. So that was always our hope sort of for these conversations, and I think it's something that we're now seeing. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Ben. And it's, I think the point that you make there, just about how these conversations are now, we're now having it with institutions. Of course, as I mentioned with RAS, this has been going on outside the institutions, and it's important to pay tribute to a lot of people who have been putting the issues on the agenda. And I think in particular Bernie Grant, who in the early 1990s started the African reparations movement. And we held demonstrations outside the British museums, and everybody at that time thought we were a little bit strange asking for this. So as you say, the agenda has moved forward. The institutions are now very seriously looking at all those issues and how we can begin this process of restitution and repair. There's obviously a lot of issues involved. There's the 1963 Museums Act that stands in the way of the national museums being able to restitute everything. So we've, in the work that we've been doing, identified 4 pathways for return. One is the change in the law. The other is trying to launch test cases so that we can actually test the law and see whether the law itself, the 63 law, is fit for purpose. And then we've looked at voluntary return, which those institutions, particularly the regional institutions who are not bound by the law, can begin this process themselves. They don't have to wait. I mean, there's obviously lots of other issues that we need to look at in how we identify, we catalog what's there, because there's a lot of stuff in basements that remain uncatalogued. A lot of the institutions don't know everything that they hold, and if they do actually have human remains and other species, sometimes the referencing has been so poor that the issues about where do you return it to, even if there is a willingness to return. So there are a lot of issues involved in the voluntary return. We also identified a 4th pathway, which we're looking at other steps that could be taken, and these is the space for creativity, and I think that response to the sacking of Benin that you talked about just now, that's in St. Paul's, are the spaces for creativity, how we can begin to look at how we repair what has happened during the last 400 years. And it's important, as I finish off, to talk about this issue of sovereignty in the context of that 400 years, because what did happen, it's not just empire. Before empire, there was slavery. Is that at the most basic level, the African human body lost sovereignty over themselves. And it seems to me that there's a huge part of the repair that needs to be done is how do we return that sovereignty to the individual. It has been done through the various campaigns that meant that slavery was abolished and everything else, but it's not just about the body, it's about the things that the body also kind of activates or is responsible for. Agency in terms of thought, agency in terms of memory, agency in terms of the creative outputs that the body is able to do as a fully human being. And just so it's about returning all of that. And I hope the conversations today will really extend as widely as all those considerations. And for me, there's one very simple thing, and I've been mentioning this to all the institutions that we've been interacting with. But so there's one very simple thing that people can do. It's important for people, as I said, to have agency over their bodies, even when they're dead. And I just don't think in 2021, 22, sorry, that it's acceptable any longer to be displaying human remains, whether they're older than 10, older than 1,000 years, or it's, at a very basic level, I think most people would want control over how they would wish to be buried. And when, the mummies, for instance, the British Museum very, prominently displays, when those people created their monuments, it wasn't for them to be gawped at on a Sunday afternoon. They had very clear ideas about what they wanted to be done in terms of their own control over their bodies, and how they wished to for history to judge them. And I think it's important that we begin to respect at a basic level some of those wishes. And if we're genuinely interested, as this theme today is on this issue of sovereignty, I think in its fullest sense, and I speak from the African perspective, in its fullest sense, we need to return that to both living and dead Africans. So I'm going to thank Cambridge again for facilitating this event today. I think we're going to hear a lot of really, and I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of really important conversations. I'm particularly delighted in the fact that students are participating today actively. They have in many cases been in the lead, the young people, over the last 2-3 years in this campaign. So it's really important that we're involving their voices. So I wanted to thank everybody, thank people from Cambridge, thank the Efua staff who have been putting this together, Janice and also Vikas who helped today. And Dan, thank you for the idea and the engagement with the regional universities, the regional institutions. I'm going to hand back now to Efua. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Onyekachi. Thank you to you and Dan for the very useful framing for today's conversation, which I'm sure will be really fruitful